The year was 1754. A 22-year-old Virginia militiaman crouched behind a fallen log, musket in hand, watching French soldiers approach through the Pennsylvania wilderness. He had never commanded men in battle before. He had never fired a shot in anger. But in the next few minutes, this young officer would make a decision that would spark a global war and set him on a path toward legend. His name was George Washington, and this moment in the forests of the Ohio Valley would be the first test of the man who would one day lead a revolution and forge a nation. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because before he became the father of his country, before he crossed the Delaware, before he stood on the balcony at Federal Hall, George Washington had to learn how to fight, and that education would be brutal, bloody, and transformative. Welcome to the story of how a young Virginia planter became America's greatest wartime hero. This isn't the sanitized version they taught you in school. This is about failure and redemption. About a man who lost more battles than he won, but never lost the war that mattered most. About someone who understood that true leadership isn't about being invincible. It's about getting back up every time you're knocked down and inspiring others to do the same. Tonight, we're diving deep into the crucible that forged Washington's character. The defeats that taught him resilience, the victories that showed him what was possible, the moments when everything hung in the balance and one man's choices shaped the destiny of millions. If you've ever wondered how ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges, hit that like button. If you believe some stories deserve to be told the way they really happened, make sure to subscribe, because this is about more than just history. This is about what it takes to become the leader your country needs when everything is falling apart. George Washington's journey to becoming a war hero began long before the Revolutionary War. It started in the wilderness of colonial America when he was barely old enough to shave. Born into the Virginia gentry in 1732, Washington grew up in a world where land meant power and power meant everything. His older brothers were set to inherit the family estate, which meant George would have to make his own way in the world. At 16, he became a surveyor, spending months alone in the Virginia backcountry, mapping territories that existed more in rumor than reality. Those early years in the wilderness taught him skills that no classroom could provide: how to read terrain, how to survive when things went wrong, how to lead men who respected strength more than bloodlines. But it was his appointment as a major in the Virginia militia at age 20 that set his true course. The French were expanding their influence in the Ohio Valley, building forts and forming alliances with Native American tribes. For the British colonies, this wasn't just about territory. It was about survival. The governor of Virginia needed someone to deliver a message to the French commanders, essentially telling them to get out or face the consequences. It was a diplomatic mission, but everyone knew diplomacy might not be enough. Washington volunteered for the job. The journey to Fort Le Boeuf in the winter of 1753 should have killed him. He traveled over 500 miles through frozen wilderness, navigating rivers that threatened to drown him in terrain that had claimed the lives of seasoned frontiersmen. When he finally reached the French fort, the commanders were polite but firm. They had no intention of leaving. Washington delivered their response to Williamsburg, along with detailed intelligence about French troop strength and fortifications. His report was published throughout the colonies, making him famous before his 22nd birthday. But fame was about to become a double-edged sword. The following spring, Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a regiment tasked with building a fort at the strategic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. What he found when he arrived was that the French had beaten them to it, constructing Fort Duquesne exactly where the British had planned to build their own stronghold. Washington was now deep in enemy territory with 150 men, facing a professional army that outnumbered him 3-1. Any reasonable commander would have retreated. Washington decided to attack. On May 28, 1754, Washington led his men in a surprise assault on a French scouting party. The engagement lasted only 15 minutes, but its consequences would echo across 2 continents. 10 French soldiers were killed, including their commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville. It was Washington's first taste of combat, and it was both a victory and a catastrophe. The French claimed Jumonville had been on a diplomatic mission, making his death an assassination rather than an act of war. Washington maintained they were spies. The truth probably lay somewhere in between, but truth mattered less than perception. The killing of Jumonville gave France the excuse it needed to escalate the conflict that would become known as the French and Indian War. Knowing retaliation was inevitable, Washington and his men hastily constructed a circular stockade they optimistically named Fort Necessity. It was little more than a wooden fence around a few crude buildings, built in a meadow surrounded by hills that provided perfect cover for enemy marksmen. If Washington had been trying to design a trap for his own men, he couldn't have done a better job. But he was young, inexperienced, and operating on instinct rather than tactical knowledge. He was about to receive his first brutal lesson in the realities of warfare. On July 3, 1754, 600 French soldiers and their Native American allies surrounded Fort Necessity. What followed was a 10-hour nightmare that nearly ended Washington's military career before it truly began. The French positioned themselves on the surrounding hills and poured musket fire into the stockade. Washington's men were trapped in ankle-deep mud, their gunpowder soaked by steady rain, their food supplies running low. By evening, 30 of his men were dead or wounded. The situation was hopeless. The French commander, Coulon de Villiers, was the brother of the man Washington had killed 2 months earlier. He had every reason to show no mercy. But instead of ordering a final assault that would have wiped out the entire garrison, he offered terms of surrender. Washington, barely able to read the French document by candlelight, signed what he thought was a standard capitulation. Only later did he discover he had admitted to the assassination of Jumonville, essentially confessing to a war crime. It was a diplomatic disaster that would haunt him for years. The march back to Virginia was a humiliation. Washington's men were allowed to keep their weapons but forced to abandon their cannons and most of their supplies. They limped home through the wilderness, defeated and demoralized. Newspapers throughout the colonies reported the surrender in excruciating detail. Critics questioned Washington's judgment, his leadership, even his courage. At 22, the young officer who had been hailed as a hero just months earlier was now being called a failure. Many men would have retreated from public life, content to tend their tobacco fields and forget about military glory. But Washington was not most men. The defeat at Fort Necessity revealed something crucial about Washington's character. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame his men or his superiors or the rain that had turned his fort into a muddy death trap. In his report to the governor, he took full responsibility for the failure. He analyzed what had gone wrong, what he had learned, and what he would do differently next time. Because there would be a next time. The French and Indian War was just beginning, and Washington understood that this defeat was not an ending but an education. The British government, alarmed by the escalating conflict in North America, decided to send regular army troops to restore order. In 1755, General Edward Braddock arrived with 2 regiments of professional soldiers and orders to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington, despite his recent defeat, was appointed as Braddock's aide-de-camp. It was a chance for redemption, an opportunity to learn from one of Britain's most experienced commanders. What Washington discovered was that experience didn't always translate to wisdom, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from watching others fail. Braddock was everything Washington was not. A career soldier with decades of European battlefield experience, he commanded through intimidation and rigid discipline. His men marched in perfect formation, their red coats gleaming, their bayonets fixed. He looked at the American wilderness and saw nothing more than a larger version of the European battlefields, where he had earned his reputation. The forests, the rivers, the Native American warriors who could appear and disappear like ghosts. None of it registered as anything more than minor obstacles to be overcome through superior firepower and British resolve. Washington tried to warn him. During the long march toward Fort Duquesne, he suggested that the enemy would not fight in neat lines across open fields, that ambushes were more likely than pitched battles, that the thick forests and narrow trails made their traditional formations vulnerable. Braddock listened politely and ignored every word. In his mind, warfare was warfare. The French might have colonial allies and forest-savvy tactics, but they were still facing the disciplined might of the British Empire. What could possibly go wrong? Everything went wrong on July 9, 1755. 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, Braddock's column of 1,500 men stretched out along a narrow trail through dense woodland. The advance guard had just forded the Monongahela River when the forest erupted in gunfire. French soldiers and their Native American allies had positioned themselves behind trees and rocks on both sides of the trail. They poured devastating fire into the British ranks while remaining nearly invisible themselves. Within minutes, the disciplined formation that Braddock prided himself on became a death trap. The British soldiers trained to fight in open European battlefields had no idea how to respond to an enemy they couldn't see. They fired volleys into empty forest while bullets tore through their ranks from every direction. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Men broke formation and ran, only to be cut down by hidden marksmen. The neat red lines dissolved into chaos and panic. Braddock himself, mounted on his horse and refusing to take cover, presented a perfect target for enemy sharpshooters. Washington watched the disaster unfold with growing horror. This was not war as he understood it. This was slaughter. The British were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that refused to play by European rules. He saw Braddock fall from his horse, mortally wounded. He watched as seasoned veterans threw down their weapons and fled through the forest. The vaunted British military machine was coming apart in the American wilderness, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But Washington did try to stop it. With Braddock down and the other officers dead or wounded, someone had to take command. Someone had to organize a retreat before the entire force was annihilated. Washington, still recovering from a fever that had nearly killed him weeks earlier, rallied the surviving troops. He organized a fighting withdrawal using the terrain and tactics he had learned during his surveying days. He moved from group to group, encouraging men who had given up hope, creating pockets of resistance that allowed others to escape. 4 horses were shot out from under him that day. Bullets tore through his coat and hat, missing his body by inches. Men fell dead beside him while he continued to shout orders and organize the retreat. When it was over, nearly 1,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The survivors stumbled back through the forest, defeated and demoralized. It was one of the worst military disasters in British colonial history. But Washington had emerged from the carnage with something more valuable than victory. He had earned the respect of men who had seen him under fire and watched him refuse to break. The newspapers told a different story than Fort Necessity this time. Instead of focusing on defeat, they wrote about the young Virginia officer who had saved what remained of Braddock's army. Letters from survivors praised his courage and leadership. One soldier wrote that Washington had seemed protected by Providence itself, untouchable in the midst of chaos. The legend of Washington's battlefield invincibility was born in that forest clearing, forged in the crucible of British defeat. More importantly, Washington learned lessons that would shape his approach to warfare for the rest of his life. He saw what happened when rigid European tactics met American realities. He understood that conventional wisdom could become a death sentence in unconventional circumstances. He realized that sometimes the best strategy was not to fight the enemy's strengths, but to force them to fight on your terms, in your territory, by your rules. These insights would prove crucial 20 years later when he faced another professional European army with everything to lose. The French and Indian War continued for another 8 years, and Washington continued to learn. He was promoted to colonel and given command of the Virginia Regiment, responsible for defending 350 miles of frontier against French and Indian raids. It was an impossible task with inadequate resources, but it taught him how to do more with less, how to keep men motivated when defeat seemed inevitable, how to fight a defensive war against superior forces while maintaining the initiative. His men loved him because he shared their hardships. He ate the same food, slept in the same conditions, and faced the same dangers. But he also maintained the discipline and standards that separated soldiers from armed mobs. He executed deserters when necessary, but also fought tirelessly for better pay and supplies for his troops. He learned to balance compassion with ruthlessness, understanding that true leadership sometimes required making decisions that no one else was willing to make. By 1758, Washington had matured from the impulsive young officer who had stumbled into international conflict. When General John Forbes launched another expedition against Fort Duquesne, Washington was ready. This time the British moved slowly and methodically, building supply lines and establishing fortified positions. They avoided the mistakes that had destroyed Braddock's army. When they finally reached their objective, they found the French had abandoned the fort and blown it up rather than face another siege. It was an anticlimactic end to years of struggle, but victory nonetheless. Washington's military education was nearly complete. He had seen how professional armies could be destroyed by unconventional tactics. He had learned to fight defensive campaigns with limited resources. He understood the importance of morale, logistics, and political support. Most importantly, he had discovered that losing battles didn't mean losing wars, and that sometimes the greatest victories came from simply refusing to surrender when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. When the French and Indian War finally ended in 1763, Washington retired from military service and returned to Mount Vernon. He married Martha Custis, expanded his plantation, and seemed content to live the life of a Virginia gentleman. But the lessons he had learned in the forests of Pennsylvania and the frontier settlements of Virginia would not stay buried. Revolution was coming to America, and when it arrived, the colonies would need a commander who understood how to fight impossible odds with limited resources. They would need someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. They would need George Washington, and this time he would be ready. This is the story of how a young man's failures forged America's greatest wartime leader. From that muddy stockade at Fort Necessity to the forests where Braddock fell, Washington learned what no academy could teach him. That defeat is not the end, but the beginning of wisdom. That true courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That leadership means taking responsibility when everything goes wrong and sharing credit when things go right. The surveyor who mapped unknown territories became the general who would map a path to independence. The colonel who defended the Virginia frontier would one day defend the very idea of America itself. Every ambush taught him patience. Every retreat taught him strategy. Every loss taught him that winning isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up one more time than your enemy. 20 years later, when the Continental Congress needed someone to lead a ragtag army against the most powerful empire on earth, they chose the man who had learned to fight impossible odds with impossible resources. They chose someone who understood that wars are won not by those who never lose battles, but by those who never lose hope. George Washington's journey to becoming a war hero didn't begin with victory. It began with failure forged in fire and tempered by time into something unbreakable.